The case of the people of the state of Michigan versus Michael Jackson-Bolanos. Mr. Foreperson, will you please read the verdict form as marked as to count 1, first-degree felony murder?
Deadlocked.
As to count 2, first-degree premeditated murder?
Not guilty.
As to count 3, home invasion first degree?
Deadlocked.
And as to count 4, concealing facts or misleading the police?
Guilty.
Good afternoon. I'm Rochelle Graham. A verdict, as you heard there, has been reached in Michael Jackson-Bolanos' trial, the man accused of killing Detroit synagogue president Samantha Woll. Let's head right out now to CBS News Detroit's Gino Vici, who has been inside that courtroom all day. Gino, as we heard, the jury was deadlocked on 2 of those counts, but they did reach a verdict on the other 2. What can you tell us?
Rochelle, that's right. You know, we've been inside this courtroom every single day the past nearly 6 weeks. You know, it's been a wild case, to say the least. Inside the courtroom, moments before that verdict was read, complete silence. There was at one point where there was about a dozen deputies that walked into the room speculating what might be about to happen. But again, this is what the jury came up with after 6 days of deliberating, 2 of those days with an alternate juror. As you mentioned, first-degree felony murder, deadlocked. Home invasion, deadlocked. First-degree premeditated murder, not guilty. Lying to police, guilty. Now, of course, on the stand, Jackson-Bolanos admitted he did lie to police about what he was doing in the parking lot to Woll's home the night she was murdered. But that felony murder charge and the home invasion charge were tied together. The prosecution alleging that he committed the felony of murder while he was committing a home invasion. Again, the jury was deadlocked on that. Now, there was no concrete evidence connecting or putting Jackson-Bolanos inside the home the night Woll was murdered. But there was circumstantial evidence presented about when Jackson-Bolanos was first seen on surveillance footage nearby and the last movements inside her home that night. And so what is next? Here is Jackson-Bolanos' attorney, Brian Brown, outside the courtroom after the jury's decision.
He's being held pending the decision from the prosecutor's office on whether or not they're going to retry the case, and the judge wanted to make a decision, hear that decision before she wanted to entertain any type of bond. So we're going to entertain his bond next week. That's if the prosecutor even decides to reissue the case.
Back here live now. Again, that decision is expected to be made, as Brian Brown said, next week, July 25th to be exact, to determine whether or not charges will be brought back against Michael Jackson-Bolanos. Rochelle, back to you.
Gino Vici live from the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice in Detroit. Gino, thank you for your coverage not only today, but as you follow this jury. We appreciate it. With me now is former federal prosecutor and defense attorney Rick Convertino. Rick, thanks for being on with us once again. Your insight always invaluable. What do you make of this decision?
Well, it's an incongruent verdict. There clearly were some jurors who believed that Mr. Jackson-Bolanos was in the apartment and did commit the felony murder. There is absolutely no evidence, not a single iota of evidence, that links Mr. Jackson-Bolanos puts him inside that apartment at the time of the murder, which occurred, according to the defense, at about 1:30 a.m. and according to the prosecution at about 4:30 a.m. There's some evidence that shows Mr. Jackson-Bolanos on surveillance around the area, about a half a mile or so from the apartment, and that's a few minutes after the last motion was detected inside the apartment, which would have required him to do pretty much a full-bore sprint to the place where he was picked up on the camera. Defense argued that there wasn't enough time for him to get from the apartment to the place that he was picked up on surveillance. That is the only evidence that links him close to that apartment, other than surveillance in and around the time that he was breaking into cars during that time.
To put this into perspective for those of you at home, this case has really grasped attention beyond Detroit, beyond the state of Michigan, the country, and even parts of the world. So many eyes on this case because it happened shortly after Samantha Woll's murder happened, shortly after Hamas's attack on Israel. And she is a very prominent Jewish figure here in Metro Detroit. With that being said, are you surprised, Rick, that the judge earlier this week said, jury, if you don't reach a decision by Thursday, I'm declaring a mistrial? Is that typical, atypical to give a jury less than a week before you declare it done?
Well, I've never had a case or heard of a case in 35 years of trying cases, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, where a judge puts a limit on the jury's deliberation. In this case, there were notes that came back saying that the jury was deadlocked. The judge rightfully gave an Allen charge to the jury, which is a charge or instruction telling the jury to go back, consider the opposing views of each side, consider all the evidence in light of that, and then try very hard to come to a conclusion and a unanimous verdict. She did that, and so then after that was done, 2 notes that said they were deadlocked. After that was done, we had an alternate jury who replaced one who had a travel conflict. So one jury was removed. When that happens, the alternate jury then reconstitutes a new jury, and all of the deliberations have to start new. All of the evidence has to be addressed newly for that incoming juror. And so from that point on, if there's not a note saying that they're deadlocked, it's only right and proper that they be allowed to deliberate fully. There's no basis under the law to give a jury a deadline if there's no note saying that they're deadlocked.
Speaking of deadlines and speaking of deadlock, can you clarify for us what happens now with the jurors coming back deadlocked on 2 of those charges? How long does the prosecution have to decide if they want to retry this case?
Well, they have to make a decision immediately whether I'm sure beyond all peradventure that the prosecution in this case has already made a decision whether they're going to proceed or not on these 2 counts. Now, they're the 2 most difficult counts for the prosecution that are still attendant and extant. They have to show that Mr. Jackson-Bolanos was in that apartment at the time that Ms. Woll was murdered, and there just simply is no evidence of that at all. There's nothing that puts him there. So whether or not they come back with a decision to, I mean, there's still immense pressure. The family of Ms. Woll made a statement after saying that this is the right man, Mr. Jackson-Bolanos. The defendant in this case is the right person. He did commit the murder. They want him prosecuted. And so there's a lot of community pressure on the prosecution in this case. And it takes it takes courage, honesty, reflection, that a prosecutor can say, this is the information we have, these are the facts we have this result from a jury, a hung jury. They're going to talk to jurors, I'm sure, to determine whether or not it was one lone juror or more. But it's the life of Mr. Jackson-Bolanos that's on stake here. And so I would like to see them not pursue this prosecution based upon the lack of evidence in this case. I think there was more than reasonable doubt to acquit him of all the charges except the last charge, which he admitted to lying to police. He admitted that when he testified. And he said the reason why. I thought his testimony was honest, direct, straightforward. He explained why he was there. He explained why there was a couple of drops of blood on his jacket. He didn't destroy the jacket. He didn't burn it. He had it in his apartment when he was seized about a month later. So given all the attendant facts in this case, I really do think it'd be a just and proper decision not to proceed, not to retry this case with this defendant.
Yeah, certainly a convoluted case. We didn't even touch on at one point DPD had another suspect. But for that reason, I'd be very interested to hear from a 4-person or another juror, and hopefully that'll happen in the days to come. Rick Convertino, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you. Thanks very much.